Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Washington. In Yemen, hundreds of thousands of people every other day are out protesting, demanding the resignation of President Saleh, who continues, we're told, to recuperate in Saudi Arabia. Now joining us to discuss the significance of these events is Walid Al-Saqaf. He's a journalist and founder of Yemen Portal. He joins us now from Sweden. Thanks for joining us.
Our pleasure, as always.
So what's happening now with these new protests, and what's the stage of the struggle there?
Well, I mean, recently, if you may have heard, there was the establishment of the National Council in Yemen, and that is supposed to be the leading force calling for the continuation and enforcement of the revolution. And it is quite interesting because in the past, the opposition did not have this bloc. It was a little bit dispersed. But now that they have this bloc, they started to rejuvenate the action against the regime. And recently they've started what they call the escalation phase, where thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of people would come out every day or every other day to protest and call for the end of the regime so as to accelerate the momentum and push it forward to show the world that the revolution is still live and kicking, and that they are willing to bring this regime to an end.
Now, who's running Yemen now that Saleh is in Saudi Arabia?
Well, officially, it's the Vice President Abdullah Mansour. That's the official picture portrayed in the media. But many of us know that in reality, it's the president's son, and in fact, his close cronies are ruling the country behind the curtains, because the army, main units of the army, Republican Guards and the central forces are all controlled by the president's family. And given that these are the real ultimate forces that could make or break in the country, their control with the hands of the president's family makes it inevitable that they are ultimately the number one force in the country and power in the country.
Now, how many protesters, roughly speaking, have been killed so far? It's been a very violent, months and months of struggle.
I'd say around 300, more than 300, but there are certainly numbers and statistics that are coming up. There are people who've been killed for other reasons, not necessarily protests, by bombings or by conflicts in certain regions. But overall, it's in the hundreds.
Now, what is the attitude of the U.S. administration to this? We don't hear President Obama talk about Yemen very often.
Well, unfortunately for Yemen, it's really fell to the background after the incident, the developments in Syria and Libya. The reality is that Yemen was given some sort of an exception in the support the revolution got from the U.S. government. And one reason may be Al-Qaeda as a threat, seen as a threat. So the U.S. is a bit skeptical not to support the revolution in a time where they are not sure if whatever happens after the revolution may affect the security in the country and maybe help Al-Qaeda thrive. On the other hand, they are also in a situation where they need to show that they support human rights and democracy in the country. It's a little bit of irony here. On the one hand, they're still more or less not letting go of all the elements of the regime, but on the other hand, they are trying to show a pretty face in terms of helping the people gain freedom.
Now, you've suggested in earlier interviews we've did that the Al-Qaeda threat in Yemen is used by Saleh to sort of guarantee this American support and to present that he's the indispensable defender of Yemen. How real is this Al-Qaeda threat in Yemen?
Well, the situation has really gone into a lot of complexities in recent months. There are cases where elements that call themselves Islamists have in fact taken over certain cities. For example, in Abiyan, they've taken Jar, the main city there. On the other hand, whenever we hear about certain confrontations between the army and those elements or Islamists, we end up having conflicting reports, because part of the army have in fact been reported to not fight those elements. And in fact, whenever there's a moment where there could be a particular offense on those Islamists, certain orders from high above tell them to stop and not attack. One incident happened today where The army was almost surrounding the region, trying to storm the Islamists, yet they were given orders not to attack. So this gives us some sort of indication that there is a game being played with Al-Qaeda.
Well, why do you think they're giving orders not to attack?
I mean, if Al-Qaeda is destroyed, then the Yemeni regime won't be able to ask for funding or ask for any assistance from the U.S. and get sympathy or any support from the U.S. or other countries. So they're using it as a card to play. And whenever they are squeezed, they bring in this Al-Qaeda threat quite evidently and telling the world that, you know, if you abandon us, then Al-Qaeda will thrive. But when Al-Qaeda or these elements who call themselves Al-Qaeda is about to be crushed, then they halt and loosen the strings a little bit so they can relive again and to fight another day.
Well, if that's the game they're playing, wouldn't the U.S. Be aware of that?
They should be aware of that, and that's what's really surprising for many of us. I would say that many in the CIA and other intelligence units are understanding there is something suspicious going on there, but maybe they are not able to put their finger on it and pinpoint where it is exactly. However, I would imagine that they do understand what's going on. That's why maybe in the coming weeks or days we'll begin to see maybe a shift in terms of more pressure on the regime.
Or is it possible that the U.S. is really committed to keeping Saleh in power, so they don't mind some of this?
I mean, in fact, there have been a lot of conspiracy theories and a lot of theories on this matter, saying part of it is, in fact, claiming that the U.S. would love that Al-Qaeda continues because eventually they have something to work on. I mean, Al-Qaeda everywhere, wherever it is in the world, involves a lot of resources and income and money and interests. So there's nothing to rule out in the whole thing. Yet, for us observers and Yemenis, we are really somewhat disturbed by this lack of forcefulness by the U.S. government.
And what about the student movement who have been at the front of the protests and the broad sections of people involved in the protests? What is their relationship to the more Islamist forces? In a sense, they both have the same enemy, being Saleh.
Actually, the Islamists have really no one single enemy. It's not only Saleh, it's everyone around them. So if we were to, of course, assume that they are genuine Islamists. On the other hand, students have always mentioned once and again that they cannot be allies of radicals, and that's what the regime would like to portray. And in fact, that's what the Al-Qaddafi, for example, portrayed about the revolutionists, about having them sympathize with Al-Qaeda or being part of Al-Qaeda. So this is a game that's been played over and over again. It's not, I think, making any difference anymore. And people around the world are aware that sometimes the regimes would, take certain steps that may be really extreme in trying to portray certain people of certain things, and that's not doing them good in Yemen.
Now, if I understand it correctly, the opposition movement, not the Al-Qaeda or Islamists, but the main opposition movements, have taken some important decision now about the nature of the struggle. What is that?
Indeed. I mean, they've come to a point. I mean, you may recall that months ago there was a little bit of a rift between the opposition and the students. Students wanted to escalate the anti-regime movement and wanted more protests and wider protests, yet the opposition bloc was a little bit dependent, or let's say cold about the idea of going forcefully, and resorted to going back to certain treaty, or let's say negotiations under the auspices of the Saudis and the US and in Europe in terms of this, if you recall, the Gulf Cooperation Council's initiative. However, that failed because Saleh refused to sign it ultimately. And 3 months after the attack against Saleh, which led him to move to Saudi Arabia, yet the regime or the president is still insistent on not signing that agreement. So he's simply saying to all the peaceful efforts, giving them the finger, you may say. I mean, he is really not giving any attention to that, and in fact he is escalating trying to incite certain armed confrontations in the country. So the opposition had actually ended up now going back to the original thoughts of the youth, and is now escalating the revolution and forgetting of all the political negotiations.
So what does that mean, escalating the revolution? And does that mean armed, or what are the tactics they're going to use?
Well, the tactics are all peaceful so far. I mean, what they've said in recent days is that our escalation will continue to be peaceful and it will never be dragged into violence, despite the many attempts, as they say, of the regime to bring them to the confrontation. However, of course, there may be a moment where the protesters are attacked in their masses, and if in order to avoid a particular, let's say, genocide, then there is this, the part of the army that supported the revolution, and that army would end up having to defend them. In which case, of course, there will be no escape from an armed confrontation.
And where is Saleh getting his money to continue running this army of his?
Well, I mean, there's no one answer to that, but if we, of course, analyze years of Saleh and power, he's been there for over 33 years now, and during this time there's been a lot of embezzlement of funds. There's been money directly tunneled from the oil revenues straight to his pocket. In fact, there have been times, even after the revolution, when the family, the president's family, had withdrew money from the central bank of Yemen directly in their billions of US dollars. So the money is not an issue for them as long as it's going to protect their interests. On the other hand, of course, we are not certain of this, but we know Saudi Arabia is in fact not hoping for a successful revolution.
Well, so you're suggesting, or is there any evidence that Saudi Arabia is financing Saleh, and is there any American dollars, at least officially, going to Saleh?
I mean, I'm not sure about whether there is real funding from Saudis or from the U.S. Yet, of course, one can draw conclusions from him staying there, given the luxury of making statements, meeting officials, doing lots of business from within Saudi land. That raises a lot of questions, and who knows, maybe there's also funding.
Okay, thanks very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network. And don't forget the donate button over here, because if you don't do that, we can't do this.